128th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite a permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Ms. Helen Clark, Member of the Elders. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I would like to remind everyone that this is an official meeting of the UN Security Council, being fully aware that today's briefing is not an easy one. For anyone in the room, I would like to remind all participants and speakers at today's discussion to engage in this meeting with utmost respect and to observe appropriate standards of tone, wording and content in their remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Excellency, Madam President, members of the Security Council, I would like at the outset to express my grave concern over the growing risk of wide-scale regional escalation. The series of explosions across Lebanon and rockets fired towards Israel in recent days adds to the volatility. I call on all sides to refrain from steps that will further exacerbate the situation and take immediate steps to de-escalate. Now, turning to today's briefing that is devoted to the 31st report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. It covers the period from 11 June to 11 September. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. Settlement activity has continued. In total, some 6,370 housing units were advanced or approved in settlements in the occupied West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. Out of these, 5,840 housing units were in Area C, including 3 outposts legalized under Israeli law, and nearly 530 housing units were advanced in the Gilo settlement in East Jerusalem. Construction tenders were published for approximately 1,100 housing units in settlements, including 780 in East Jerusalem. In settlement-related steps on 18 July, the Israeli Defense Forces Central Command signed a military order amending an order from 1995 that implemented the Oslo Accord, so as to grant the military commander in the area of authority over planning and construction in certain parts of Area B that had been transferred to the Palestinian Authority. The civil administration on 25 June declared over 12,700 dunams of state land in Jordan Valley, adjacent to 8,000 dunams declared in March. Demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures continued across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Citing the lack of Israeli-issued building permits, which are almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain, Israeli authorities seized or forced people to demolish 373 structures, displacing more than 550 people, including 250 children. 26 of these structures were donor-funded. Evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem also continued. Following a Supreme Court ruling on 15 August, Israeli security forces evicted the Shehada family from their home in Silvan in favor of a settler organization, displacing 35 Palestinians. 180 Palestinians, including 111 children, left their occupied West Bank communities, citing violence and harassment by settlers and shrinking grazing land. On 19 July 2024, the International Court of Justice rendered the advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Among its findings, the court reaffirmed that the Israeli settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the regime associated with them have been established and are being maintained in violation of international law, and, among other things, concluded that it was of the opinion that the State of Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. It further stated that the State of Israel continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, that the State of Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, that all states are under an obligation not to recognize as legal the situation arising from such unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Security Council Resolution 2334 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including all acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation and destruction. Unfortunately, the devastating conflict in Gaza has continued alongside daily violence in the occupied West Bank, with a high number of fatalities incidences, precluding me from detailing it all. In Gaza, according to Gaza Ministry of Health, from 11 June to 11 September, at least 3,920 Palestinians were killed and at least 10,200 were injured. This brings total reported numbers by the MOH in Gaza since 7 October to more than 41,000 Palestinians killed, a majority of whom are reportedly women and children. According to Israeli sources, 101 hostages are still being held captive of the 251 hostages abducted on 7 October. On 1st of September, the IDF discovered 6 hostages in Gaza killed by Palestinian armed groups, including 2 women, and in a separate operation recovered the bodies of 12 other killed hostages and rescued 1 hostage alive. Israeli sources also reported over 1,580 Israelis and foreign nationals killed by Hamas or by other Palestinian armed groups, including at least 338 women and 40 children, and 783 members of the security forces since 7 October in attacks, either in or originating from Gaza. Israel continued to conduct strikes from air, land, and sea, resulting in tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties, massive displacement of civilians, and widespread destructions, including civilian infrastructure. Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to hold hostages in horrific conditions, with reports of severe maltreatment, launched attacks at Israel forces, and fired rockets and other projectiles indiscriminately towards Israel. Israel stated that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continue to place fighters and military equipment among and underneath dense concentrated areas with civilians. Israeli operations continue throughout Gaza, displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. 89% of Gaza has been placed under evacuation orders at one point or another since 7 October. New evacuation orders have reduced the size of the Israeli designated humanitarian zones at Al Mawasi to just 11% of the size of the Strip. Repeated attacks on 30 schools and airstrikes in densely populated areas continued, resulting in the death of internally displaced people sheltering in those locations. On 11 September, 3 IDF airstrikes on IDP tents in Al Mawasi and Khan Yunis killed at least 19 people and injured at least 60 others. The next day, 2 IDF airstrikes hit Al-Jaouni school sheltering IDPs in Nusrat, killing at least 18 people, including children, women, and 6 UNRWA staff. UNRWA said it was the deadliest incident in the agency's history. The IDF stated that the target in each strike was a Hamas command and control center. On 13 July, according to Gaza Ministry of Health, at least 91 Palestinians were killed and over 300 injured in an IDF airstrike on Al Mawasi, which, according to the Israeli government, killed the commander of Hamas Al-Qassam brigades, Mohammed Deif. On 10 August, an IDF airstrike on the Al-Tabin school in Gaza City, sheltering approximately 6,000 IDPs, killed at least 93 Palestinians and wounded a dozen others, according to Gaza Ministry of Health. The IDF said that 31 militants were killed in this attack. On 27 August, despite being clearly marked, a World Food Programme team was struck by gunfire on its moving towards IDF checkpoints, sustaining 10 bullet shots. On 9 September, the IDF shot at the UN convoy supporting polio vaccination for children in northern Gaza, causing heavy damage to UN vehicles and held the convoy at gunpoint for 8 hours, threatening to arrest 12 UN staff. In the reporting period, at least 27 UN personnel were killed in Gaza, bringing the total number of UN staff killed since 7 October to 224. Meanwhile, violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continued at alarming levels. 160 Palestinians, including 4 women and 28 children, were killed during ISF airstrikes, search and arrest operation, armed exchanges, demonstrations, and other incidences. 1 Palestinian was killed by Israeli settlers. A total of 849 Palestinians were injured, including 147 by tear gas inhalation and 370 by live ammunition. A total of 86 Palestinians, including 9 children and 3 women, were killed by airstrikes. In August, Israeli airstrikes in the occupied West Bank killed at least 1 Palestinian every day on average. Since 7 October, 185 Palestinians, including 33 children, have been killed in airstrikes in the West Bank, as reported by ISF. That underlines that it's hitting military targets. According to Israeli sources, 14 Israelis, including 2 women and 9 security force personnel, were killed, and another 67 were injured by Palestinians in shooting, stabbing, and ramming attacks and other incidences. ISF carried out 1,673 search and arrest operations in the occupied West Bank, resulting in 1,295 Palestinians detained, including at least 57 children. The special representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict expressed her deep concern about the recently published reports by the UN describing a dramatic deterioration in conditions of detention for Palestinian men, women, and children under Israeli custody since 7 October attacks. These reports of sexual violence and other inhumane and degrading treatment could amount to sexualized torture perpetrated against Palestinian men and women. In July, Israeli military police arrested several Israeli reserve soldiers suspected of the serious sexual abuse of a Palestinian detainee. In occupied West Bank, most Palestinians were killed in the context of ISF operations in Area A, including during the exchanges of fire with armed Palestinians. These situations are characterized by increased use of airstrikes, IEDs, and destruction of both private property and civilian infrastructure. From 5 to 6 August, the IDF conducted a majority operation in Jenin, killing at least 6 Palestinians and in 2 airstrikes and with live ammunition, and injured another 7 in armed clashes. From 28 August to 6 September, the IDF conducted its largest operation in the occupied West Bank since 2002, stating that it was targeting Hamas and PIJ members and infrastructure in Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas. The Palestinian Ministry of Health said that 36 Palestinians were killed and dozens wounded during the operation, including 8 children. The IDF bulldozed water, sewage, electricity, and communication lines, and approximately 70% of the road network in Jenin city, citing the IED threat to its soldier. 1 IDF soldier was shot and killed during this operation. High levels of settler-related violence continued. On 16 August, scores of armed settlers attacked the Palestinian village of Jit in Qalqilia, shooting and killing 1 Palestinian man, injuring another, and setting fire to Palestinian-owned houses, vehicles, and agricultural land. Israel launched an investigation into the incident. A number of senior Israeli officials condemned the attack. On 26 August, dozens of armed Israeli settlers attacked Wadi Rahal village in Bethlehem, during which a Palestinian man was killed. Violence against Israelis by Palestinians also continued at high level. On 11 August, an Israeli man was killed in a shooting attack in the Jordan Valley, for which Hamas claimed responsibility. On 18 August, a Palestinian killed a guard in the Israeli settlement of Kedumim. The following day, Hamas and Palestinian PIJ claimed to have conducted what appeared to be an attempt of suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, which led to the death of the attacker and the injury of 1 civilian. Madam President, the Security Council in its resolution called upon both parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. Unfortunately, such acts continued. A joint statement from Hamas and PIJ threatened a return to the use of suicide bombings, a call echoed in a speech by a senior Hamas official, while Hamas Al-Qassam Brigade published a graphic leaflet showing an explosive belt and a bombed Israeli bus. In a video posted on social media, an Israeli minister said Palestinian prisoners must be killed, shot in the head, while urging the passing of the bill by the Knesset, allowing capital punishment for terrorist offenses. Another minister said of Palestinians in Gaza, nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, until our hostages are returned. 2 Israeli ministers made visits to the holy sites in Jerusalem, with one of the ministers calling the site Israeli sovereign territory, while speaking of policies to change the status quo. The Israeli office of the Prime Minister stated that there was no change to the status quo. Madam President, Resolution 2334 reiterated calls by the Middle East Quartet for affirmative steps to be taken immediately to reverse negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the 2-state solution. The catastrophic public health conditions in Gaza continued to deteriorate as access to safe drinking water and sanitation facilities continued to shrink. Severe shortages of fuel and medical supplies continue to limit the functionality of remaining hospitals and healthcare centers, particularly in the northern part of Gaza. Education continued to suffer, with Gaza's 600,000 children having missed an entire year of school and evacuation orders forcing over 30 temporary education centers to close. Despite of these setbacks, UNRWA expanded learning activities. In August, the Palestinian Ministry of Health confirmed the first case of polio in 25 years. A polio vaccination campaign was launched on 31st of August by WHO and UNICEF, with support from other agencies, including UNRWA, which has thus far vaccinated 70% of some 650,000 children under 10. Following the Israeli military ground operations into Rafah and the subsequent closure of the Rafah crossing in May, humanitarian organizations faced many obstacles that impeded their ability to regularly pick up supplies entering through Kerem Shalom, Kerem Abu Salem. These included continued hostilities, impassable roads, and deteriorating civil order. On 6 August, the Israeli Minister of Finance said Israel will confiscate $26 million of Palestinian clearance revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority and transfer it to families of terror victims. The next day, Israel terminated a customs clearing mechanism with Norway that reportedly holds nearly $220 million of Palestinian clearance revenues in escrow of demanded funds to be returned to Israel. Israel describes this as a response to Norway's recognition of the state of Palestine in May. In Israel, some 120,000 Israelis, including 50,000 children, have been displaced from their homes in the south or north of Israel in the context of the hostilities. Madam President, in Resolution 2334, the Security Council also called upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territory occupied since 1967. No new steps are known to have been taken in this period. In its advisory opinion on 19 July 2024, the International Court of Justice expressed the view that the member states are under the obligation to distinguish in their dealings with Israel between territory of the State of Israel and the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Resolution 2334 also called upon all parties to continue inter alia to exert collective efforts to launch credible negotiations on all final status issues in the Middle East peace process. Intense negotiations between international mediators and the parties continued in Doha and Cairo to formulate a deal for a ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza. On 27 June, Canada announced that it has imposed new sanctions on 7 individuals and 5 entities for their role in facilitating, supporting, or financially contributing to acts of violence by Israeli extremist settlers against Palestinian civilians and their property. The US and European Union also announced another round of sanctions and restrictive measures against settlers and its entities. On 13 July, Argentina designated Hamas a terrorist organization and ordered a freeze on its financial assets. From 21 to 23 July, 14 Palestinian factions, including Fatah and Hamas, attended reconciliation talks in Beijing, where they signed a declaration reiterating their commitment to form a national unity government and implement previous agreements. Madam President, in closing, allow me to share the Secretary General's observations on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I once again strongly condemn the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on Israel on 7 October 2023, their continued holding of hostages in Gaza, and the recent deliberate killing of 6 hostages whose bodies showed signs of severe mistreatment. There is no justification for the deliberate killings, maiming, torture, and abductions of civilians and the use of sexual violence. Hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, and for as long as they are held, they must be treated humanely and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I condemn the continued indiscriminate attacks, including the firing of rockets towards Israeli population centers and the use of human shields, which are prohibited by international humanitarian law and must cease. I again unequivocally condemn the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and the deprivation of essentials to survive. Nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I'm concerned over what may amount to a serious violation of international humanitarian law, including possible non-compliance with the principle of distinctions, proportionality, and precautions. I mourn the UN staff killed in Gaza and strongly condemn the killing of all health and humanitarian personnel. These incidents must stop immediately and be thoroughly and independently investigated. The level of suffering witnessed in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate as Secretary General of the United Nations. To address the colossal humanitarian needs and improve the intolerable conditions of civilians, Israel must fully open all crossings into Gaza and facilitate the immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale directly to the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip in accordance with its obligation under international humanitarian law. I reiterate my call for an immediate ceasefire to end humanitarian suffering, urging all sides to redouble efforts to reach a deal that will bring about an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. I continue to engage all stakeholders towards these objectives. A deal is crucial to saving lives, releasing all the hostages, reducing regional tension, and enabling the UN, in cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, to accelerate efforts to address the pressing needs of the Gaza population. I welcome the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and United States to reach a deal. I strongly condemn all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. The escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank and Israel is highly alarming. Palestinian refugee camps are sustaining significant infrastructure damage during ISF operations throughout the occupied West Bank. I urge the security forces to exercise maximum restraints and to use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. I call on the Israelis to abide by its obligations under international law. All those injured must have access to medical care, and humanitarian workers must be able to reach everyone in need. I also recall that Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to ensure that the civilian population is protected against all acts of violence, and call on Israel to ensure thorough, independent, and prompt investigation of all instances of possible excessive use of force. I am deeply concerned about the large number of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israeli security forces, and the increase in the number of Palestinians held in administrative detention by Israel since 7 October 2023. Reports of torture and other ill treatment during arrest and detention, including sexual violence, are also deeply concerning. I condemn the attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including in the proximity and with the complicity of Israeli security forces. The attack on Git was illustrative of the increasingly coordinated and deadly nature of these attacks. Attacks by Palestinians against Israel must also cease immediately. I condemn Hamas' attempted attack in Tel Aviv, and I'm alarmed by its call to return to the use of suicide bombings. All necessary steps must be taken to hold perpetrators accountable. I reiterate the utmost need to uphold the status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem, taking into account the special and historic role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy sites. I remain deeply troubled by the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israeli policies and practices are systematically altering the land in the occupied Palestinian territory, creating dangerous dynamics to an existential threat to the two-state solution. Settlement expansions, settler violence, and recent Israeli administrative steps and large-scale state land declarations in the occupied West Bank are fundamentally changing the landscape and deepening the occupation. I reiterate that the establishment of Israeli settlement in Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. In this respect, I note the recent findings of the International Court of Justice mentioned above in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures may entail numerous humanitarian rights violations and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. I note the conclusion of the International Court of Justice in this regard. I urge the government of Israel to end these practices in line with its obligation under international law. Palestinians must be allowed to build legally and address their development needs. I'm alarmed by the multiple instances in which officials have engaged in dangerous provocations, incitements, and inflammatory language, which must be rejected by all. I express my deepest appreciation to UNRWA and all the UN agencies and personnel and humanitarian aid workers who remain committed to their work across the OPT despite the significant security risk. I'm deeply concerned by efforts to undermine their life-saving works. The inviolability of UN premises must be respected at all times by all. To meet the challenges ahead, we must establish political and security frameworks that can address the humanitarian catastrophe, start early recovery, rebuild Gaza, and lay the ground for a political process to end the occupation and establish a two-state solution. These frameworks must facilitate a legitimate Palestinian government that can unify Gaza and the occupied West Bank politically, economically, and administratively, while reversing the steady deterioration dynamics in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian unity is an essential building block to just and lasting peace. Israeli measures that undermine the PA must be urgently addressed. The government of Palestine will require significant support from the international community to advance these objectives. Finally, any lasting progress cannot be divorced from the ongoing Israeli occupation and unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Progress towards peace must address and fully realize the fundamental and legitimate right of Palestinians to self-determination and sovereignty over the entirety of the occupied Palestinian territory. It must also address Israel's legitimate security concern. We must collectively take steps towards establishing a political framework that outlines tangible, irreversible steps towards ending the occupation and establishing a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security on the basis of UN resolutions, previous agreements, and international law, with Jerusalem as capital of both states. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards that goal. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Wennesland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Helen Clark.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Security Council, it is an honour to speak to you today as a member of the Elders. Resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a priority for our group since its founding by Nelson Mandela in 2007. The implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2334 is acutely relevant to the current devastating phase of the conflict and to any chance of securing a fair and durable two-state solution in line with international law. But its failure so far also poses an existential question. Can the Security Council enforce its own resolutions? This is surely crucial to its credibility. The Elders unequivocally condemn the 7 October terrorist attacks and the holding of hostages by Hamas, which have caused deep trauma for the Israeli people. We also unequivocally condemn Israel's disproportionate military response, including its bombardment, siege, and blockade of Gaza. This amounts to collective punishment and is causing great suffering and trauma to the Palestinian people. The Security Council has a responsibility to chart a path towards a sustainable peace. A full, immediate and complete ceasefire in Gaza is an indispensable step. It is deeply disturbing that Security Council Resolution 2735 calling for this remains unimplemented. It is clear that unless and until the root causes of the conflict are addressed, violence will persist and escalate. The conflict management approach pursued by powerful members of the international community has failed. A new approach is needed, grounded in international law, including the enforcement of this Council's resolutions. Council members who question the binding status of these resolutions or who use their veto to protect an ally or to oppose a geopolitical rival are eroding the Council's authority. They also undermine their own reputations and long-term interests. All member states are also bound to respect and comply with decisions of the International Court of Justice. This includes the provisional measures ordered to protect Palestinians in Gaza. The ICJ's recent advisory opinion, while non-binding, is an authoritative landmark ruling. It concludes that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestine territory is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. This obligation does not depend on achieving a successful outcome to peace negotiations. The General Assembly and Security Council should give effect to the advisory opinion by passing resolutions endorsing it and setting out what action is required by Israel, other member states and the UN to bring an end to the occupation. The Elders welcome the passing of the General Assembly resolution on this issue yesterday. How will the Security Council respond to the advisory opinion? Security Council Resolution 2334 reaffirmed the illegality of the settlements. Yet settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem continues to accelerate, while attention is focused on Gaza. More decisive member state action is needed. All member states must distinguish between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory in all forms of cooperation and cease any assistance to or trade with illegal settlements. Targeted measures should be applied against state and non-state entities and individuals responsible for maintaining and expanding illegal settlements. Steps have already been taken, including by the United States and the European Union, to sanction settlers for attacks on Palestinian civilians. But sanctions should also target financial flows to entities which are funding and constructing illegal settlements, and those in the government of Israel who are pursuing annexation. This Council must respect the process of criminal accountability through the International Criminal Court, including the ICC prosecutor's request for arrest warrants in response to alleged atrocity crimes by Hamas and the government of Israel. Member states seeking to undermine the ICC are damaging the international rule of law. They are undermining accountability in other contexts, including in the context of Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. This must stop. There will be no security for Israelis or Palestinians if the war in Gaza is followed by a continuation of unlawful occupation and annexation. But without a decisive change of direction, this seems likely. The Elders propose a set of guiding principles to underpin a pathway towards sustainable peace, based on self-determination, sovereignty, and mutual security for both peoples. First, full UN membership and recognition of the State of Palestine should be supported by all Council members and other states now. Statehood is not dependent on peace negotiations. Strengthening the Palestinian Authority remains crucial, but statehood should not have to wait for governance reforms. Second, normalisation of relations between Israel and Arab states is essential for Israel's long-term security and for regional stability and prosperity. But full normalisation must be conditional on Israel ending the occupation permanently and supporting the implementation of a two-state solution. Third, the security of Palestinians and Israelis must be given equal weighting. There can be no sovereign state of Palestine with continued Israeli security control over the Palestinian people. Israel's security concerns do not justify unlawful occupation or annexation. Fourth and final, the goal of a single unified government overseeing Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem should be supported by all Palestinian factions, including Hamas, and by the entire international community. Sustainable peace will require reconciliation under the umbrella of a revitalised Palestine Liberation Organisation based on adherence to international law. Violence against civilians by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups must end. All of this requires bold, principled leadership and the political will to break with the failed policies of the past. All forms of leverage should be applied, including the suspension of arms transfers in response to continued violations of international law. Only by implementing international legal obligations, ensuring accountability, and ending impunity can a path to end this conflict be created once and for all. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Clark for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia. Excellencies, in March I hosted in our capital representatives of two organizations, Women Wage Peace and Women of the Sun. Together they led the Mothers' School. They are Palestinian and Israeli mothers, determined to stop the cycle of violence and change the reality of the conflict between the two nations, for the benefit of their children and for generations to come. And I was very much inspired by what they described as resistance in hope. We are at the precipice. Almost a year into the war, the devastation and immense suffering of civilians continues relentlessly. Hostages have not returned home. Civilians in Gaza continue to endure unprecedented levels of violation and destruction. The potential to engulf the region in a wider conflict remains at all-time highs. The latest escalation in Lebanon is another sign of it. Despite that, I, just as the mothers I spoke with, continue to embrace hope. Hope that peace returns to Gaza and the West Bank. Colleagues, firstly, we need compliance with international law. Since day one of this conflict, we have called for the compliance with international law. Instead, serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law persist, challenging the very notion of the international law framework which we collectively establish to safeguard all people and to protect the most vulnerable in particular. On top of that, resolutions of the Security Council and provisional orders of the International Court of Justice are being blatantly disregarded. Such violations weaken the credibility of our institutions and erode global trust. In the shadow of the appalling situation in Gaza, settlement policy and expansion has accelerated at unprecedented levels. Settler violence is on the rise, and the situation in the West Bank is boiling. The status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem is being repeatedly violated. Negative trends must be met with positive and concrete steps. I therefore warmly welcome the adoption of the General Assembly resolution following the ICJ advisory opinion, providing tangible steps towards a blueprint for peace. And it is now time for the Council to follow suit. Secondly, we need respect. More respect for the prevailing sentiment of the wider UN membership, which demands a ceasefire and a just and lasting peace. We need more respect for the UN system, including UNRWA, and more compliance with its charter. This is the best prospect for alleviating the unimaginable suffering. We need a more respectful and action-oriented dialogue in this chamber, one that prioritizes peace over partnership. We also need respect and dialogue between people in the region. This starts first and foremost with leadership for peace on both sides. Leadership cannot be based on incitement, hatred, provocation, or terrorism. It equally cannot endorse such actions, and it must be respectful of other opinions, especially of civil society. Thirdly, we need courage. Courage to uphold our communities to the two-state solution, which remains the only path to durable peace. I say this as a foreign minister of a country who has taken a clear stance for peace in the conflict. We have decided to be active in this Council and to deliver on what we promised during our campaign, building trust and securing the future. We therefore took the decision to vote for membership of the State of Palestine in the United Nations. We also recognized the State of Palestine. I urge others to take similar steps. Universal recognition of Palestine and its admission as a full UN member is an essential element in our shared agenda for peace. The future of peace in the region